Hello, and welcome to Just One Q, the podcast where we explore the latest ideas in workplace belonging in conversation with thought leaders and experts. Each episode, a guest and I dive into a question that highlights their area of expertise. The goal is to leave you with the tools and insights you can use to make your workplace better and more human-friendly. I'm your host, Dominique. I'm an inclusion educator and advocate working for Dialectic, an inclusive workplace learning consultancy in lovely Guelph, Ontario, which is situated on the treaty lands and territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the traditional lands of the Chinoochton and Haudenosaunee peoples. My guest today is Dr. Sara Kafashan. Sara is an applied social psychologist, educator, and consultant whose work integrates mental health, adult learning, and human-centered organizational change. With a background in higher education and community-based research, she designs and facilitates learning experiences that are evidence-based, trauma-informed, and grounded in lived experience. Sara's approach blends psychological insight, critical pedagogy, and systems thinking to create environments that are inclusive, deeply humanizing, and transformative. Her work supports individuals and organizations in navigating complexity with care, fostering cultures where equity, belonging, and growth can thrive. Sara, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Dominique.
It's an absolute pleasure. And today we'll be exploring the theme of identity as curriculum and the question of how does lived experience inform DEI facilitation, connections, and dialogues. And, teaching or facilitating emotionally difficult subject matter is something that DEI and HR professionals do frequently, but this is also something that many academics, coaches, therapists, healthcare professionals have to do. So in conversation, I'd love to explore the role that identity and lived experience play in this teaching or facilitation. So is lived experience helpful or harmful? Is it necessary or nice to have? How can we protect ourselves or others when we work in areas that are aligned with our experience or identity? So to situate this conversation, Sara, I'm wondering if you can just share a little bit about your professional background and the emotionally difficult teaching or facilitation that you have done.
For sure. Thanks so much for that introduction. I'm so excited to be here, Dominique. And, with a topic like identity as curriculum, it's something near and dear to my heart. And I can share a little bit about that, how I've sort of found my way into this area. So I'm an applied social psychologist, which means I've done teaching in formal academic settings within undergraduate and graduate levels within the social sciences. So topics and courses such as social psychology, human rights, community development, social work, all within that juicy realm of work. But I've also worked in non-formal teaching contexts. So for example, I've had a role specific to advancing wellness and resilience initiatives, facilitating conversations about how we cope with stress, right? Navigating work-life balance, how we stay resilient and bounce back, and, what does thriving look like for us? Most recently, however, my work was really situated within EDI, so equity, diversity, inclusion, where I was facilitating dialogues and learnings on topics such as understanding diversity, privilege and power, microaggressions, responding to racism, and fostering equitable and inclusive spaces. So certainly within those roles, I've had a lot of opportunities where, my identity in hidden and not so hidden ways have showed up and become, center stage in what I'm doing.
Yeah, absolutely. That really resonates. I mean, I'm also working in the DEI space, and I think it's very normal almost to have an expectation of, mining your personal experiences, whatever they may be, or to highlight the degree to which you're sort of outside of that center of power and privilege and kind of like leverage that. It's a sort of a normal expectation within that field. So, and I'm sure that applies to a lot of our listeners out there too, who find themselves really relying on their lived experience in their roles. I'd love to dive into this more, and I want to talk about the work that you're doing around this. So, as a result of all of your teaching experience, you and Lauren Spring have launched a research project looking into the intersection of identity and teaching roles. And I just want to be clear for listeners up front that this is, a project that's underway and it's in the data collection phase. So today we'll be talking about, themes from the prior research and knowledge and some of the preliminary findings that you have, but we will get the full story in a book chapter that's coming out later this year. But Sara, can you tell us a little bit about this research and what the main questions are that are guiding it?
For sure. Like you said, a lot of the times with EDI work or DEI, whatever acronym we like to use, facilitators come into the space and they acknowledge their social-cultural, political identities, right? They like to situate themselves. And that's quite common, I find, in the practice of DEI workshops. But what happens when you're teaching a course, an undergraduate, diploma level, graduate, whatever, a formal course, and these topics come into play and you have identities that are tied to them, right? It's not usual or common, I would say, that a faculty member stands up in the beginning of the semester and says, here are my identities and here is how it's going to tie. Not that they do that in DEI, but there is a little bit more of that kind of situating yourself. And so Lauren and I are really interested in how and why or why not teachers bring their unique identities into the learning space, especially when they're teaching topics that are emotionally complex or challenging and topics that I say are, closely tied to our humanity. So, for example, faculty who are teaching or doing research on topics within critical disability studies, historical and cultural studies. So, things like Black history in Canada, for example, Indigenous studies, MAD studies, and perhaps social work. So anti-racism, anti-oppression. And what happens when a faculty member may have some lived experience of that topic? So let's say a faculty member has lived experience of navigating a mental health system or gender discrimination, and they're teaching on those corresponding topics, right? So in other words, lesson content is intricately woven into parts of their identity. And, in those stages, and in those circumstances, how do they choose or choose not to incorporate themselves into those teachings? In what ways do they self-disclose? So that kind of really leads to three main inquiries for us. First is really about, when and why my educators choose or refrain from self-disclosure in the classroom. And does having lived experience make one a better educator in these topics? Why or why not? Second line of inquiry is about pedagogical tools. So besides lived experience or even with lived experience, how do they, use pedagogical tools, teaching strategies and methods to address these emotionally complex and challenging topics and conversations? And then the last line of inquiry is really around faculty mental health. So what toll, if any, does this take on faculty members when they're teaching about topics that are emotionally complex and woven or tied to their identities?
Yeah, so that's a very comprehensive look at the topic, of course. Like this research seems to be tackling it kind of on all fronts. I'm hearing, when and why. So this is sort of trying to document what people are doing in the classroom, like what is currently the practice, and then what tools, so like on a practical level, kind of like what methods and strategies people are using. And this could be maybe some sort of a toolkit that could be shared with others who are having to navigate this topic as well. And then the toll part is also very interesting because it's sort of giving a new voice to this issue, and sort of highlighting that. So I appreciate the sort of three questions and that broad approach to the research. And I'm personally looking forward to reading the results of the inquiry because I think it's really valuable. So, and of course, now I'm going to ask you all these questions about the answers that you don't quite have yet, but I understand that there's a lot of that prior knowledge, and this work isn't entirely new to you, of course. So I'm curious, just up front, if you can take a stab at answering the question, how important is it for DEI facilitators or educators to have that lived experience related to the topics that they teach? Is it essential? Is it valuable?
Yeah, I think, if I was going to answer in a very short answer, I would say yes. I think it's extremely valuable, right? And we see that. But I do think the answer is more nuanced, and I'll get through that. I think it's extremely common when we're looking at any job postings, positions related to equity, diversity, and inclusion. We often see that lived experience is either a requirement or a preferred asset. And so within these positions, oftentimes candidates are expected, right, and encouraged to share parts of their identities and lived experiences in cover letters, during the job interview, on the job, in facilitation and case studies, etc. And I think when we think about this and this notion of how important is lived experience for DEI facilitators or educators, there's sort of three vantage points that I tend to take. One is really along the sides of kind of the institutional, or what I call meta notions of knowledge kind of side of things. So things like who holds the knowledge and who creates knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when we're involving lived experience here, it's a great way to kind of move the needle on what we formally consider knowledge, right, and evidence. Oftentimes within academia, there are very sort of objective experts that hold the knowledge about topics, right? And so when we move towards a lived experience approach, we're really centering lives. We're centering lives and experiences and diversifying the perspectives and voices within the academy. We're trying to kind of rewrite the dominant narrative, right? That expertise is solely held in professionals and institutions and authorities through, kind of detached and very objective, careful study. And this kind of allows us to, reinforce a notion that personal and direct experience with these topics are very much needed to be incorporated, especially when we're tackling such complex, nuanced, and layered social issues, right? That are tied to identities, and that, if you and I were in the exact same room, our experiences may be different, right? With regards to these social issues.
Yeah, and in that respect, that feels like essential, right? That feels
Yeah.
like the work that really does need to be done at the level of academics and just generally in society. But when you think about, something as broad as science and the perspectives that have shaped that over time, and oh, like we haven't even included women's bodies or experiences in a way
Yeah.
to define entire fields this way. So that
Yeah.
work of reintegrating and refocusing on stories and experiences and testing, what is true for different people, I think that's, obviously when I think of including those identity pieces on purpose is like the highest ideal, and it makes the most sense to me.
Mhm.
That's just one angle that you were saying.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I mean, so it's great, right? That's why I said if I was going to answer the question with one
Mm,
or two words, I would say it's great. But nuance comes in when we think about other vantage points. So when we extend the institutional kind of point of view to maybe the teacher or the practitioner side of things, there is a tension between, the traditional model of being objective and distanced versus the kind of lived experience model. I come from a background of psychology, and even though I'm not a clinician, a lot of my psychological training was, kind of in that context of you're either in the distanced, detached kind of expert side, but then there was kind of this rise of the peer support model, right, where lived experiences is at the forefront, where you kind of introduce yourself in that way to kind of let them know that you have these experiences that can help you connect and understand in different ways. So identity can really shape both credibility, but also vulnerability in the room,
mm,
right? What we share in these contexts can support our learning goals, can help really, bring to life some of the things that we're teaching. And sharing a part of ourselves is also a way to kind of, teach in a relational way, which I'm definitely a proponent of, especially again, like I said, with complex social issues where everyone's identities in the rooms are intersecting and intermingling. But how much do we share?
mm.
Right. And how personal do we get? Do we go to, do we share this specific story or that specific story? May it come across as unprofessional, incompetent? May it open us up to further criticism or scrutiny? Right. So, for example, we know, regulatory bodies like the College of Nurses Ontario or College of Registered Psychotherapists Ontario, just to give examples, lots of these regulatory bodies have this where they license practitioners based on their mental health and fitness to practice. And so how are these stories, these lived experiences being used once they're out there in the world, right? I think that's a big part of it. Because
Right.
these stories have power, and they they have power to shape, and contribute to the power structures of how knowledge is being told and what stories are being told. So for example, a recovery story about mental health, right? Are we kind of limiting it to a very specific way of recovery, which sometimes that's what we see, right? We're not allowed to talk about different kind of pathways. So there's that side there from the practitioner or teacher side where there's a lot of passion, right? Where you're talking about your own lived experience and there's meaning and purpose in doing that, but you're opening yourself up for risks.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and I guess like the further you are from, power and privilege, like the more marginal that identity, the bigger the risk can be as well, because like those disclosures can just bear a lot of weight on like promotions and other types of opportunities. Like if that balance of credibility isn't maintained or it's somehow eroded by the disclosure, that's always a risk, right?
Yeah, for sure. And lots of different risks that we can get into. And the last piece I wanted to add to that is the learner perspective, right? So like I said, it can be really valuable for learners to hear these lived experiences, especially if these learners or audience members have identities that are underrepresented, right? That are not perhaps being seen or valued in the heteronormative and hegemony of narratives, meta narratives in the world. So there are benefits to that, but it can also really create a wedge, right? Because if the professor or the facilitators perspective is something that's so out of the realm of what the audience or learner has experienced, you start questioning, right, the competence or this person's authority to kind of speak to these things. And especially in the context of DEI, you start questioning their motive, right, and quote their agenda for teaching these topics.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing a lot of that right now with, backlash of DEI in general. And there's like definitely some discrediting of people that's attempted, right? Like, and when people are emboldened, when learners or in a workshop are sort of emboldened by anti-DEI sentiment, like that stuff can be quite dangerous and powerful and damaging. And yeah, so I see that for sure, that like disconnect between the lived experience of the learner and the lived experience of the facilitator can be sort of a barrier as well.
For
Mhm.
sure. Yeah.
So, I mean, it sounds like a very nuanced thing. There are obviously benefits, there are risks, and at multiple levels. Can you give some examples of how lived experience is becoming a requirement in academia?
Sure. Yeah. So we talked about, job ads, particularly in academia, but in other positions as well. Within, higher education, we do hear of departments and courses that are really, prioritizing lived experience or what they call the insider perspective, right? So where they want lived experience at the forefront of the curriculum, the way it's designed, the topics, the conversations, the case studies, and that puts faculty with lived experience at the forefront. And that's something that they're sort of going with, all the while acknowledging that this puts faculty in a position of taking, what we call curricular risks. So these risks that we talked about of putting them in the line of fire, so to speak, right in front of the class to kind of share that, to bring up their personal identities. And I know of, various individuals who are doing that currently as part of their work in academia. So for example, there's a professor at the University of Guelph who's within the field of early childhood education. And this individual brings their experience as a queer person and scholar into course design, research, right? Shining light on topics like gender, disability, body image, sexuality, how are these things framed in ECE or early childhood education? Another scholar I know of is Chris Chapman, who is a scholar within social work. And, within Chris's work, he's written about his kind of cognitive dissonance and his feelings that kind of arose in his time working in social services, where he was required to restrain and confine disabled Indigenous children, right? So kind of talking about the system that you are part of, right? The practice that you are part of, the discipline, and having the kind of, I think, vulnerability to critique it, right? And really talk about those kinds of feelings, because it prioritizes, quote, insider experience or perspective, but also it's not an official part of the curriculum, but something that many who go through the program and come out and practice in those fields are going to experience. They're going to feel, they're going to walk through. And so bringing it out in the open in those ways.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think there's been outside of academia as well, right? Like this shift toward focus on lived experience and identity requirements in job postings, even in the mainstream job market. Like I've noticed, the obvious ones would be, for example, race related or cultural related requirements or preferences that are stated on, not requirements, I don't think they're ever phrased as requirements, but strong preferences, right, for DEI or advocacy roles. I've also seen job postings that ask for, experience of substance use disorder, for example,
Mhm.
or like, let's say a role in a rehabilitation or harm reduction setting. So these are things that are kind of, I think would have been unthinkable like a decade or two ago. And now
Yeah.
I'm seeing them sort of all the time. So I think there is like an echoing of what's happening in academia just in the broader context that most of our listeners would be familiar with.
Mhm. Yeah, for sure. There is that huge shift. Like I said, in psychology, it was, the professional quote, traditional way of holding yourself as distance, moving to the peer support model and how
Mm,
it works in the clinical practice as well, right? I know I read a book by a clinician who was one of the first people to boldly publish a book as a psychological clinician about her own mental health and
mm,
psychosis, falling into psychosis, right? And that was very taboo, not so long ago.
yeah. And now it's like expected. If you don't
Mhm.
have the experience, it's like, don't maybe take up so much space in the room. So it's an interesting shift in both academia and sort of the job market at large. So I want to ask you, what is the impact of teaching or facilitating, these difficult topics that are aligned with personal identity or past experiences of trauma? What are some of the things that either you've experienced or observed or talked to people about in terms of the impact on them?
Yeah. In the research project that I'm working with Lauren on, we have a book chapter, and the title is Risks and Rewards. And I think that really kind of ties into the impact of facilitating difficult topics when you have an identity that ties, to previous experiences of trauma or how it shows up in these contexts. So on one side, right, the rewards are it's hugely positive. Like we were talking about, there is, a step in the direction where we are correcting historical wrongs here, right? We're balancing the inequity of power and voices and perspectives in higher education and curriculum development to create a bit more, broader sense of what is knowledge, who can hold knowledge, and to make that expansive and inclusive. But at the same time, like we said, there are risks involved, right? We're talking about it sometimes, you said that it's a preferred asset. I have personally seen it where it is a requirement, right,
Mm,
as well. And when it's there, in addition to what we talked about, licensing bodies kind of having an eye on that, it kind of begs the question, will this individual be able to maintain ownership over their own stories and their perspectives, right? Will they be able to decide how much to share of themselves, right? Will they kind of be told, or is it expected because you were hired for this lived experience that you should be sharing it, right? And if so, then in what ways? With whom? Who's going to be using that story? Is someone going to be supporting you or asking you to kind of massage the story, right? How does that kind of go? And of course, in addition to that, it's scary to share our stories, right? Because like we said not so long ago, these are things that were, quote, not professional. You don't bring it, right? It's very much separate from your workplace, your work identity, your roles. It goes against the meta narrative. So even though the expectation is changing and lived experience and peer support is coming into the forefront, we still all are raised with kind of meta narratives and societal norms that, we want to keep our professional side, quote, professional, and away from maybe our personal side. And then when we bring these stories into these public settings, whether we're teaching students or audience or colleagues, we don't know how they're going to respond, right? How is it going to go? How is my lived experience of navigating the mental health system going to land with my colleagues, with a group of students? How will they respond? Will they understand? Will they question me? Will they question, quote, the truth of what I'm saying, right? And then within all of that, there's the other layer of, if you're a facilitator, you are the manager of the space in the room, right? So on top of sharing your personal stories and being vulnerable, now you have to kind of manage the group, right? Navigating potential kind of responses from others, potential microaggressions, sense of denial coming at you or towards other kind of members in the group. So balancing this need to perhaps protect yourself, but also be cognizant of other identities in the room, how they're responding, all while, ensuring folks are learning, right? So that's a lot to kind of
It sounds impossible,
think
really.
about. It does. Yeah, it really does. And I think a big part of this that goes untalked about is the emotional labor, right? That's often invisible and unpaid behind all of this, and how much that can take out of you in doing this work.
That's a really interesting angle. Like the concept of emotional labor to me, this, hidden, unpaid labor, I think of it as something that was popularized in the context of household labor. So often, women are doing the emotional labor, and that includes like being the default parent, et cetera. And then more recently extended to workplaces. In teaching, who is doing this emotional labor, and what forms does it take? Can you give us some examples?
Yeah, for sure. I'd love to take a step back though, Dominique, if you don't mind, just because you're right. When we think about emotional labor, unpaid labor, a lot of us go to the context of households.
Yes.
But when we move it towards, workplaces, I want to kind of preface that what we mean by emotional labor in the workplace is where, the process of navigating, suppressing, performing, managing emotions is very much required part of one's job. And this is very much, commonplace. It's very, it's explicitly woven into professions like in healthcare and education, hospitality, just to name a few. But the thing here is, who is actually expected to, engage in emotional labor and why, right? So what we see there, getting back to your second part of the question, in teaching, who's doing the labor and what form does it take? We know from research that faculty with intersecting diverse identities are at the forefront of conducting emotional labor. So in particular, female faculty of color or femme faculty of color disproportionately take on emotional labor in various forms. So they are they're the ones listening to students and their personal struggles within academia. They're the ones there to reassure their colleagues. They're the ones there bringing up questions of diversity and inclusion at departmental meetings, explaining why it matters, right? How it impacts different parts of the organization. And then other researchers have kind of built on that and have argued that, it's not just, femmes or women of color who are faculty, but all diverse faculty. So faculty that identify as women, Indigenous, Black, racialized, disabled, mad, queer, any sort of diverse identity, they're expected to perform higher levels of emotional care and labor than non-diverse counterparts.
Can you give like a more specific example of what that would actually look like in practice? Like what that expectation would feel like? So what's the difference between somebody who has that expectation on them and somebody who doesn't?
Yeah. So for example, women generally are known compared to men to be emotional caretakers, right? And so we see this in the research. If a student is distraught or wanting to discuss academic struggles, they're more likely to go to a female professor than a male professor, right? This also plays along the lines of other types of identities. So imagine you are a female in a male-dominated field, and your class, these students or your audience members are, let's say, 90% male, right? And then you have the few females there who have never seen a professor in engineering who's a female, right? And now they want to kind of connect with you because there is that kind of identity there that they haven't seen represented, right? So then that builds a different level of connection and trust, which translates to more support, which, ultimately is a wonderful thing. right? It's great. We want representation. We want students, we want audience members to see themselves in different, in their facilitators, in the learnings, in the things that they're
Right.
taking in.
But it's
But
not for free.
it's not for free, right?
Yeah.
And it's not equally distributed. It's not acknowledged, right? It's unpaid and it's hidden. And it can be very exhausting, right? Adding all of that on top of a full workload.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I can really appreciate that extra load would exist on people who are disclosing personal things in the context of their job, that it makes them also just seem open. Like if you have disclosures or you're sharing your lived experience, like it's almost an invitation, right, to others to sort of be able to do the same. So you become I'm sure your inbox is just a little bit fuller than someone who isn't, giving that signal of openness and sharing. In general, this feels like a real balancing act. So there are so many good reasons for people with lived experience and specific identities to teach these emotionally difficult subjects, but there's also extra work, it's taxing, there's risk involved.
Mhm.
Um, at an organization or even at a team level, what can we be doing practically to support teachers or facilitators doing this work?
I think that's a really important question, Dominique. And that's, you know, one of the underlying questions behind the research project that I'm part of, right? We're wondering, if within academic institutions, we're moving towards hiring more faculty, more individuals with lived experience, what institutional structure, resources, supports are available to kind of offset the risks and the tax, right, that comes with this type of work. And I would argue, first off, it's really much an acknowledgement,
Mhm.
right, that there are elements there that get unpaid and are hidden forms of emotional labor. Make it, kind of make it known, right? Because the people who are doing the work know that that's part of it, but it's often not kind of factored into their job fact sheet or, their job responsibilities, right? Or the
Right.
amount of time it takes to kind of prepare those things. And so having those pieces factored in to their parts of their job responsibility and using as a guide to make, equitable work distributions within teams. Another thing that could be really helpful is dual facilitation or co-teaching to help lessen the burden of covering emotionally charged topics. So co-teaching, in a DEI context, it may be especially helpful. And I know that there's research that kind of talks about this. So when we are teaching about DEI, the overarching emotions felt by audience can actually be separated based on race. And
Mm.
what we see is that, white folks in DEI trainings often experience a lot of guilt and a lot of shame, right? Conversely, on the other side, bodies of color in the same training, right? It could be the exact same training, are perhaps, experiencing validation, right? They're experiencing being seen and realizing that these experiences don't just happen to them, it is actually happening to other people with similar identities. And so it can be a very different experience for both, sets of learners or audience members. And so it can be difficult, right? So for me, I'm a woman of color. I find it incredibly difficult to teach about topics like white guilt and white fragility. Why? Because I don't have lived experience about that, right? Ironically, it kind of ties back to that.
Yeah.
And what we see in the research is that it's actually, co-teaching can be particularly helpful in these contexts where a white co-teacher or facilitator could teach about white guilt, white fragility, maybe share their own lived experience about their journey, right? While, other facilitators or facilitators of color could talk about the bias, discrimination, microaggressions, right? What does it mean to be an immigrant, right? All these sorts of different identities that can show up in the context of understanding and learning about power, privilege, diversity, etc.
Yeah, I think this is such a critical point. And I mean, just drawing from my own personal experience, I think it is something that smart facilitators figure out. Because you do experience that where it's like, as a white facilitator, I can't speak to, or I don't feel comfortable or appropriate speaking about certain lived experiences that aren't my own. And I
Mhm.
can give it voice to a degree, but it obviously has more reach, more impact, and more credibility coming from someone who's lived it. And likewise, I don't want to put a person of color in the position of having to field some of the horrible questions that come out of these sessions at times from people who are just like at a different point in their journey and wittingly or unwittingly can be pretty harmful in the types of questions that they ask or the types of comments that are shared. And
Mhm.
so it then does benefit everyone to have like access to somebody who can say, oh, like without, being personally injured, I can sort of help you deconstruct that and, shut it down if necessary, but also just give some voice to like how I can maybe see how you might think that, but here are, five steps in between, and let's take this walk together. Um,
Mhm.
yeah, so
Yeah.
I think that's such a valuable point, and that it's broadly applicable to these other types of roles where that's the case. Like the DEI one is just like the clearest one, but thinking
Mhm.
about how that can play out in different organizations is really interesting.
Yeah. And I mean, there's the other side of the coin here too, right? Because what I'm not saying is that, if you're white, you can't be talking about DEI, right? Or you can't be talking about experiences of identities that you don't have, because there's also, true allyship, right? And supporting each other in the learning, right? Because the learning, again, if it falls entirely on folks of colors or bodies of colors, that's where the emotional labor comes in again, and
Yes.
what we call the minority tax for sure.
Hmm.
So, yeah, you're so right in that there's so much there in this discussion, especially in organizations and teams. And I think these are some of the pieces that are highly tied to the risk of burnout and DEI,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And if we have teams and organizations really kind of understand that that is a higher risk, right? Not only that, there's a higher risk that performance reports are going to have negative comments, right? Or, because you're teaching or you're touching on topics that are contentious, that
Mhm.
people have strong opinions about. So comparing, let's say two learning and development, professionals, one that focuses on EDI and one that focuses on, other things.
Yeah.
Um,
Anything else?
yeah, anything else,
Yeah.
honestly, the feedback, right? Like, and sort of the interactions are going to be very different, right? And is that taken into consideration when
Hmm.
we look at performance appraisals, promotions, right? That kind of thing, because that's just part of it. And then again, more on that kind of hidden labor, right? Within organizations, those that hold EDI roles, tend to perhaps be the ones that are gone to for additional questions, just like we talked about in academic settings, right? So ensuring that organizations and teams are well resourced, that, they're not siloed, that there is understanding of DEI concepts on a broader level. And it's
Hmm.
not just, one individual to kind of educate or inform, let's just say not just the team, but the entire organization
Yep.
on these types of topics. And that happens, of course, we know.
You're bringing so much nuance into this answer, so I really appreciate it because that's a ton. That's a ton of things that can be done to help. And so, not just saying, well, it's a risk and that's it, and we're going to leave it there, but like there are actually things that can be done on at the team level or at the organizational level. And just to bring that back to something very simple, in my own experience, like I have written courses, for example, on sexual harassment in the workplace. And I remember a time where I had to write this course, and I did not have to dig very far in my own experience, right, to come up with examples. But man, was that a taxing time because it was really like churning over that old soil and seeing what I could mine from my personal experience to give like these characters in scenarios things to say to each other. And something that was really helpful was my team, A, checking in, B, acknowledging that it's hard, and C, giving extra time. Like if I needed a break, like if it's like, do you need to just park that for a day or two, have some palate cleansing work, and then come back to it? And I remember just that acknowledgement feeling so good and,
Mhm.
having camaraderie in the act of having to mind my personal experiences made a huge, huge difference. So I do
Yeah.
believe that there are right ways and wrong ways of doing this.
Yeah. And I mean,
Yeah.
I think, first of all, that sounds like, it sounds like you had a great team supporting you. So I'm glad you had that. And I think part of why, some of these EDI roles end up being siloed or being, the one position that does anything and all things related to EDI is part of the problem, which is people don't want to get it wrong,
Hmm.
right? People don't want to make mistakes. And I think I can so see that perspective. I totally understand. It's scary to make a mistake, any type of mistake, but a mistake on something this emotionally charged, this intricately tied and woven into people's identities. No one wants to do that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think, we still have to try,
Yep.
right? And so that I would say is part of maybe something that organizations can think about as organizational culture, right? Having discussions, broader discussions about what does it mean to be a true ally, right? How can I actually support? And when I make a mistake, not if,
Yeah.
when I make a mistake, because, I'm an ally to many different identities as well, right? That I don't hold a part of in my identity. And I make mistakes too, right? So how do we kind of come back from that? How do we, move forward from that? I think those types of conversations embedded within dialogues and institutional and organizational culture are so important because it's what kind of leads to perhaps more sustainable change, I think.
Right. It just creates that sort of baseline awareness that then these other sort of, not interventions, but
Yeah,
helpful initiatives can sort of grow out of, is
yeah.
having those conversations at all.
Yeah, but they need to be, just like I said, part of your job responsibility,
Yeah.
right? Paid
Yeah.
work. It can't be sort of like you're now on this committee that you're doing on the side of your desk kind of thing, because that's where it can get really difficult, right? Because you've already got a whole, you know, responsibilities, and now this is something thrown on top, and you don't know how to do it, perhaps, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, absolutely. So like, we've touched on a bunch of things that we can do at the team or organizational level. And I want to kind of bring it down to the teacher or facilitator, practitioner level. So what can we do personally to guard ourselves from emotional injury as we do this really important work that we want to be doing and that we care about?
mhm. Dominique, that was something I used to ask myself every day, and I probably still ask myself, right? I think there is just an inherent risk, if I'm being honest, as we do, this type of EDI work. And why do we do it? Right? Because many of us are called to do it because it's so meaningful, it's so important to us that we do take those risks and we do it. But I do think there are small ways that we can try to kind of, set ourselves up for success, right? So strategic disclosure,
Mm,
um, really thinking intentionally, choosing to share or withhold parts of the story and identity, right? Think about it in advance, weigh the risks, how might this story be perceived in a way that tokenizes, that re-traumatizes? How may it have professional backlash? How might it impact audience members with similar identities, right? But perhaps different experiences. So thinking about, best examples that we can use to incorporate, how we incorporate them. So for example, I do a lot of narrative writing just for leisure, but as an applied social psychologist, I explore themes around EDI and my life in my writing, right? And sometimes I sort of turn it into fiction, and that's sort of how I might, disclose, right, in a
mm,
safe way some of my experiences. And I do that as well sometimes when I'm teaching, right, or facilitating. Do I decide to share, make up a case study, and have these elements come from real experiences that are mine and perhaps others? How do I tell that story? How do I incorporate the lived experience? There are ways that we can do it that can help the facilitator feel more safe and less vulnerable.
mm. Yeah, I mean, I love that you brought in writing and the idea of scenarios or sort of a bit of a narrative distance because I
Mhm.
think like in my current role too, something that I use a lot is just scenarios. So it doesn't necessarily like you can bring that wisdom, but you don't always have to make it personal.
Mhm.
And so, but I also really like that piece about giving it some thought ahead of time. Like if you are going to be in a position where you may feel inspired to share something, weighing those risks and not just like, you know, going into something without having thought about the potential consequences or risks. It's a really good reminder. So I appreciate that.
And I also think, thinking about like, who are you sharing this for?
Yeah.
A
Yeah.
lot of the times, like I share, even when it feels vulnerable, so that other people who hear it, who resonate, who have had those experiences, feel validated, feel seen, right? Because it's not common to hear those experiences, especially by someone who's maybe facilitating a room or, quote has, there's power associated with being the facilitator in the room, right? And so sometimes, especially if it's a younger audience, like youth or in universities or colleges, it's the first time they're hearing someone that they perhaps look up to, speak about experiences that they've had that, they maybe never want to talk about, they never want to share, they're embarrassed about, right? And now they're kind of seeing how that has kind of shaped these conversations and supported learning in a really meaningful way. So definitely also asking, who are you sharing for? And, how could this be perceived or received?
Yeah.
And sorry, go ahead.
Well, I just want to kind of expand on that a little bit. Like, I feel like even with the best planning and
Mm-hmm.
acknowledging that some discomfort might be present, or, making a strategy for what we want to share and why, I still feel like it's possible to be caught off guard in the middle of a lesson or a workshop. So, like, I'm wondering if we can chat maybe through some strategies to consider when that happens, like when a learner says something dismissive or harmful, or, that vulnerability is exposed. Is there anything, we can do to sort of repair that or make the most of the moment?
Mm-hmm. I love this question, Dominique, and I feel like it could be a whole episode by itself, or a series even by
Yeah.
itself in some ways, because I think there's so much nuance there. Anyone who has facilitated difficult dialogues, anything related to DEI or emotionally complex topics, knows that you know audience or learners can respond in ways towards the facilitator, towards each other, right? Be dismissive of others' experiences. And there's no matter how much, we kind of put in place, these moments can carry really high emotional risks and potential for wide and long-lasting impacts, right? I do think there is a difference between, outright hate and discrimination versus, what I perhaps call like gray zone remarks, where
Sure.
someone is maybe clarifying something and it's ends up being a microaggression, right? Now it's still a microaggression, right? But how do we kind of navigate it and keep it to be a learning space? And one thing I'll talk a little bit more about that, because I think there are kind of notions of how now the research is really not, there's no consensus on this.
Mhm.
It's really emerging, and it's part of the reason why we're doing our research as well, to kind of understand. What we do know from research is that if you're a facilitator and an interaction happens, whether it's directed towards you or towards other group members in that group, ignoring it because it's uncomfortable to address, or because we don't know what to say, or because we're caught, in the middle of things, unfortunately doing that, it actually does more harm.
Sure.
And as a facilitator, you're expected to manage and lead the space. And when you don't kind of intervene to keep that container safe, or you don't even acknowledge that something may be kind of coming in to break that safety, people lose trust,
Mm.
right? And learners often view, so I know there was a research study that talked about how professors who don't kind of mention or just acknowledge, a microaggression or some sort of discriminatory statement, learners view that professor as someone who is as harmful as the person who made that transgression,
Mm.
right? So you're seen almost as someone who said it, right? Because you allowed it in that space. And there's so many things to balance, right? So what do we say? At the same time, whose safety are we prioritizing? Is it ourselves? Is it the learners? Is it the one who, the dismissive remarks were directed to? Is it, how the person who said it, right? Maybe it's unintentionally, but it was very hurtful. How do we kind of go about that? I think I tend to kind of break it down into proactive and reactive strategies.
Okay.
So proactive strategies really talk about setting out ourselves up for as much success as possible. So we talked about some of these, right? Can we have co-facilitation
Right.
where, one maybe, intervenes and supports one group and another, and you kind of do that piece? Can we go into sessions with a lot of lesson planning, right? A lot of understanding of sharing with the group. What are some guidelines of how we are going to have these difficult conversations,
Yeah.
right? I tend to, when I'm facilitating these types of conversations, I usually have, um, a, a little bit of a conversation about what it means to create a brave space, a brave learning space, right? I often say I can't guarantee safety because what safety looks like for me is going to look different for someone else. But what I'm hoping to create is a brave space where we can make mistakes, but we can kind of understand that we're doing this in an effort to learn together, right? And we will make mistakes because that's just part of EDI work. So guidelines for how we're going to communicate and how we're going to engage with each other, setting up learners with individual learning or work prior so that they kind of come in with similar base knowledge or, similar
Right.
level of understanding.
Oh, I love that. Yeah.
Um, and then, sort of having spaces, like taking control of spaces where there will be space to discuss and having a very kind of direct question, right? Or prompt for them to discuss as opposed to, how do you feel about X, right?
Yeah.
Right. That kind of can open up all types of things versus, in what ways might X serve this group
Sure.
or, in
Yeah.
this context, et cetera. Right. So kind of specific. That's where we talk about like case studies can be really good because it takes away the personal element and just draws it to the context or the situation.
Yeah, absolutely. So are those are the proactive ones, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you talked about like reactive ones, like when you've done all you can and you're still standing there and someone has said something terrible.
Yeah, and that will still happen, as we know for sure. So, what I always say is, at minimum, if you don't know what to say, you're caught off guard, which happens, pause, take a break, right? Simply pause the session. That we know from research is better than ignoring or dismissing it in the moment because we're frazzled, we don't know what to do. So, just simply say, we're just going to take a quick break right now, and then from there, it's I think turning your attention to support those who've been impacted,
Mm,
right? This is where I said there's a difference between outright hate in the space versus hate or discrimination versus, gray zone kind of remarks or comments, right? With something that is, clearly hateful, discriminatory, then we want to kind of even go to the extent perhaps of removing that person from the space, right? Making sure that we want to make sure that we're not allowing for additional harm to
mm.
be. But then we also have to balance, right? How are we going to support individuals who've been impacted? And we don't always know who's been impacted, right? So if someone makes a comment, let's say directed at a specific identity, let's say Muslim folks, right? And there's a person who's visibly Muslim in that setting that it was maybe directed to. Now, we would know that person would be impacted, but we don't know who else in the audience may be impacted, right? Just because they may not have overt symbols of Islam or, they have loved ones that represent these identities.
Yeah.
And so how do we navigate that? Where do we put our attention? And I would sort of vouch for a way where we try to navigate all of that, right? So if there's two facilitators, you can kind of have one person maybe talk to the individual who's directly harmed, but you do need to come back and bring it back to the entire group as well, right? To kind of address what's happened and how we can kind of work through that and hold space because something like this, we're never really going to get closure, right? There's kind of the ongoing notion of this conversation and the dynamic. And sometimes you can even use that in a proactive strategy as well, just being like, accept and expect non-closure from these conversations, right? And these interactions. So
An
yeah,
interesting idea to like weave into the beginning too, right? Just the
Mhm,
sense that it's going to be an ongoing thing. Uh,
mhm.
Yeah, these are some really great ideas, and I like it's just making me want to stand on a chair and yell like DEI needs danger pay or something because it's just so fraught and it feels really daunting, but I really appreciate the granularity and some of these, proactive and reactive strategies. I'm certainly going to be rethinking how I organize my own facilitation in light of these suggestions. So they're super valuable. Thank you so much for suggesting those. It's a wonderful answer to that question.
Thanks so much, Dominique, and thanks for asking the question and giving me the opportunity to kind of share some of my thoughts around that.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, thank you so much for this interview, for spending time explaining about your work and for your presence here. You've given me a lot to think about, and I want to encourage my listeners. If you are curious about Sarah's work, you can definitely go and connect with her on LinkedIn. Apparently, you have an open door policy when it comes to LinkedIn conversations. Sarah, is that true?
Yes, absolutely. I love to kind of connect with anyone and have, formal and informal conversations about anything that I've talked about here that, sparks your interest.
Beautiful. And then, of course, check the show notes for more information about Dr. Sara Kafashan's book chapter, which is coming out later this year. And as I always say, please reach out to me if you'd like to be a featured guest on this podcast or if you'd like to nominate someone. I love having conversations with L&D, HR, and DI professionals who are passionate about their message or with folks in adjacent fields who have something to teach us in these people and culture and learning roles. I am a real person. I am fallible and susceptible to colds, even as you can hear in my voice. So you can email me anytime. And if you like what you're hearing, please leave us a rating and a review or share this episode to your own socials. It really does help get the podcast into more ears and stop AI from stealing my job. More on that in an upcoming interview with Andrew Barrett. So thank you again, Dr. Kafashan. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks so much, Dominique. This has been wonderful.
I'm Dominique Atrell. Thanks so much for listening, and see you next time on Just One Q.